Hi, study leaders. A friend showed me this really cool screen capture add-on, and I'm going to give it a try as a way of sharing with you kind of my overview and outline for the different chapters of Romans that we're going to be going through. This is really for you. In this overview, I'm not going to give you all the questions that will be in an outline. It's going to be linked. This is kind of give you an overview of kind of how I've sectioned out this particular lesson and some ideas for you, and hopefully things can become clear to you so that you can lead your study well. So to start off, I think one of the first things you should do this week, since we just spent 4 weeks not studying Romans, you should recap what you talked about in the first 3 weeks. So talk about an overview. What is the book of Romans about? Who wrote it? Some of those kind of details. Let's get back into the book of Romans. Where do we find the thesis of the book? How does Romans 1:16 through 17 show us where Paul is going, what he wants to do? And then also, what was chapter 1 about? I want to show you guys a really helpful diagram. I'm going to make this little thing smaller for a second here. This is by a guy by the name of Mark Berry. He's a pastor, visual artist, and he's got a website. You can see it linked right up there, visualunit.me. You can download this chart, and I think this is one of the simplest and most visually appealing overviews of Romans, and it kind of just shows you where you're at different sections. And as we're just about to talk about, anytime we're doing a particular study on a verse or a chapter or a section, we got to remember what place that section has in the scope of the rest of the book. So as you can see, we're only doing 1 through 9, and you can see what these other sections do. But after Paul's introduction, he gives the theme in verses 16 through 17, introducing the gospel. This book is about the gospel, and this runs through the whole thing. Then in 1:18 through 8:39, he titles this section "How the Gospel Impacts Our Relationship with God." And I think that's a really good way to view this. And the first place that this goes is chapters 1:18 through 3:20, talking about the wrath of God. And this is part of the gospel. And we need to understand this. We need to understand where we're at in Paul's argument in order to understand what should I be taking away from this particular study. So go ahead and look at this, download this, show it to your study. I think it's going to be really useful to you as we go on. Now, one of the first things I think you should do after you recap the previous section is correlate and do an initial application. So correlate means, where does this fit? So ask the question, where does chapter 2 fit in the overview of the book of Romans, or in this particular section? What purpose does it have in Paul's argument? And what was Paul's intended effect on the reader of just chapter 2, of just this section? What's Paul trying to do in it? I think that'll help us to ask this next question. How does Romans 2 apply to Christians today? And I think you should ask this study at the beginning, ask this question at the beginning of study as well as at the end of study. How does this chapter apply to me today? And that'll help us to keep from just theorizing and keeping it abstract and far away from us. This will help us to bring it in. And asking it at the beginning of the study begins people to think about it. At the end of the study, maybe they'll be able to walk away with something that they didn't see at the first part. Now, this could be something you could show at the end of study. I wouldn't do this at the beginning of the study, but I want to give you kind of the idea that I've had thinking about Romans, this whole section of 1:18 through 3:20, talking about God's anger. I think the effect of it is to show the sin in my heart. And the question I'm asking is, how does this section, and particularly this week, Romans 2, magnify my sin so that I experience more of the gospel? So how do I see this as written to me? And I think Paul did have that intent. This isn't just for Jews or for the Romans then. This is God's eternal word, and it speaks. And one of the ways that illustrates this is a really simple kind of depiction of the gospel that I heard by a pastor by the name of Randy Pope. And he describes the gospel this way. The gospel is, we had it all, we lost it all, he did it all, and we get it all. That's kind of a simple way to talk about what the gospel is in the whole scope. We had it all. God created the world to be with us and to share his glory with us and for us to experience life with us. And we lost it all. And we saw that in Romans. And then Jesus did it all, which is what Paul is going to illustrate in the coming chapters, as well as we get it all. But this particular pastor talks about how we can distort the gospel and lose the significance of it when we take out and lessen what sin is, and we make it not quite a big deal. And so the gospel becomes this: we had a lot, we lost a lot, he did a lot, and we get a lot. So in the gospel now, it becomes something not that you get everything, and in a relationship with God that compels you to live in light of His word and righteousness and law and all of that kind of stuff. But it's kind of just like, well, He did a lot, so that means if I want to get more, I probably need to work more. So if I don't believe that I lost everything when sin entered into the world, and that my sin lost me everything with God, when I forget what Romans 1:18 through chapter 3:20 is about, then I lose sight of the gospel. And the gospel is not going to be as great. So that's part of the vision of keeping us grounded in what are we supposed to take away from these sections that always seem like talking about sin and God's wrath and that sort of thing. So again, how does Romans 2 magnify my sins, that I experience more of the gospel? So next I'm going to talk through the 3 sections I've broken it out into and just highlight a couple things. Again, I'm not talking through the whole outline, but this is just how I've structured it off. Section 1, I've put as chapter 2, 1 through 11. And as part of enforcing good study habits and skills, help people observe the structure. So chapter 2 starts with the word therefore. And the easiest way to talk about that is, what's the therefore? Therefore. It links what Paul was talking about previously to what he's going to talk about now. So ask that question. So this is the first paragraph, verses 1 through 5. Then the next part of that, verses 6 through 11, that's the next paragraph. And there's a couple things that I want you to anticipate that you probably already do. But you might have noticed how verse 7 and 10 might make it seem like Paul is talking about justification by works. He says, God will render to each one according to his works. To those who, by patience in well-doing, seek for glory and honor and immortality, he'll give eternal life. It sounds like salvation by works, right? And then verse 10, but glory and honor and peace for everyone who does good, the Jew first and also for the Greek. And then verse 11, for God shows no partiality. I just want to highlight for you and help you anticipate that. And rather than just explaining it, there's a couple things you could do. Number one, a good response is to say, do you think that Paul is saying everything that is true about the gospel in these verses? Or is he explaining everything that the gospel is just in these verses? I don't think he is. Is there anything more that Paul is going to say that might help us understand the relationship between salvation and works that maybe he's hinting at here, but not quite explaining yet? And if you have time, I give a number of cross-references that you could go to if people are really struggling with this. But I would say discuss it, but don't spend too much time on it. Paul hasn't finished his explanation of the gospel yet. He's just getting started. Section 2, I've given as chapter 2, 12 through 14. And you could discuss a lot in this chapter. This whole chapter 2, you could talk about any number of things, but you really got to pick, where do I really want to focus on? What are the main questions I want to ask? And how do we want to apply this? And then if we have time, what are some of the rabbit trails we could go down? One of the rabbit trails you could go down in here is talking about to what extent the Jew or the Gentiles have the law. Paul says, for when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they're a law to themselves, even though they don't have the law. Now, if you get wrapped up in that, I would say don't spend too much time on this, because you got to focus on what's Paul's point here. Paul's point is that it's not having the law that makes you justified before God. It's doing it. And he's about to show how the Jews had the law and they didn't do it. Therefore, they weren't justified. So it's not having the law that makes you righteous or justified before God. That's his point. But he's trying to show that because of the way that God created everyone, even Gentiles, and there's a number of ways you can understand this, but the Gentiles who didn't have the law oftentimes would put the Jews to shame because they did more of what the law required than the Jews did, even though they didn't have it. The second part of section 2 that I think you could spend some fun time illustrating on is 17 through 24. Paul gives this kind of list of characteristics or privileges that the Jews had. If you call yourself a Jew, rely on the law, boast in God, you know his will, you approve what is excellent because you're instructed from the law, and you're a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness. You instruct the foolish, you teach children, and in the law you have the embodiment of truth and knowledge. These are privileges of being a Jew. And then in the next section, Paul goes on to illustrate that they use these privileges not to do these things, but to boast. So something that you could do that might be kind of a cool activity is replace Jew with Christian and word with law, or Bible with law. So it would read this way: but if you call yourself a Christian and rely on the Bible and you boast in God and you know his will, you approve what is excellent because you're instructed from the Bible, and you're sure that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of children, having in the Bible the embodiment of knowledge and truth. Do you see how this could kind of apply to us? So the question that you could ask after you do that, well, what kind of things do Christians brag about? Do you ever think of yourself more highly than non-Christians because you're a Christian, because you have the Bible, because you live better than they do? This is part of how you can draw out the application of this chapter. The last section, I put this like this because I think it's really important. Section 3, chapter 2, verse 25 through 29, where Paul's talking about circumcision. And there's a lot you could talk about here and wrestle with, well, what is circumcision? What was it supposed to do? And at the end of this video, I'm going to stop what I want you to hear. And if you want to keep listening, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what I think Paul's meaning by circumcision here. But here's a couple pointers that can, I think, bring some comprehension to this from this section. You can ask the question, what did the Jews use circumcision for, according to what Paul describes here? And because, again, they were using it as something to boast rather than using it for God's intended purpose. So the Jews didn't use circumcision in the way that God intended it, largely speaking, or this person that Paul is talking to. Then you could ask, are there outward expressions of being a Christian that we use to boast to non-Christians? Again, a way to apply what Paul's talking about here. Then in this section, I think it's really important to note, who is the person who circumcises? And in verse 29, Paul says, Jews one inwardly, circumcision is a matter of the heart by the Spirit, not by the letter. So the one who circumcises is the Spirit. So ask the question, if the requirement to become a Jew was circumcision, what do you have to do to become a Christian? Have your heart circumcised. Well, how do you do that? Well, it's by the Spirit. And then finally asking the question, what does circumcision express itself in if it's a matter of the heart? And this hopefully could be a way to kind of bring full circle some of the questions that you maybe were wrestling with at the beginning of it. And there's just one thing I want to illustrate that you could draw out and illustrate in the same way that I think is kind of cool. Don't pay attention to the right side here yet. So this is the outward versus the inward according to verses 28 through 29. And let me read it again just so it's fresh. For no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly. Let me start again. For no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly, nor is circumcision outward and physical, but a Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is a matter of the heart, by the Spirit, and not by the letter. His praise is not from man, but from God. So if you focus on the outward, which is really what the Jews were, or this person that Paul is dialoguing with is talking about, circumcision is a physical thing. It's outward. It's a physical behavior. And because it's physical and because it's behavior, it's something that's visible to men. And things that are visible to men can become something that we seek approval for. Because if men can see it, if people can see it, then it's something that we could feel good about because we do it or we have it or express it, something like that. Paul contrasts this with the inward, that circumcision is a matter of the heart. It's something that's inward, it's spiritual, it's of the heart. And because it's of the heart, it's only visible to God. You can't see in the heart of another person, but God sees the heart. So this is my question for application. Growth in which area will merit approval from God? Outward behaviors or inward heart attitudes and loves? Paul says, the man whose heart is circumcised doesn't seek the praise that comes from man, but he seeks the praise that comes from God, because God sees the heart. And when our heart changes, that's when God approves of us, not in a saving way, not in a works earning kind of a way, but in the relational kind of way. It feels good when somebody approves of you. God as our loving Father who delights in us and wants what's best for us. when he sees our heart transformed and changing, and our loves realigning to what he loves, we receive our approval from God. And that's when we're not seeking it from man. So that's going to kind of wrap up the overview of this section. Hopefully this has been helpful. There's a couple links in the description there for you. If you want to stick around, I'm going to talk a little bit more about circumcision in some ways that I think are really cool, but maybe not something you talk about in your study. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me, text me, call me. Find me on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and Snapchat. Thanks.